Hi everyone, thank you for coming. I'm Cristal Almonte, one of the PFF fellows, and so I'm going to be hosting this, and my co-host Jonathan Aragon is also here. We're going to be focusing on reflexivity in crisis and beyond strategies for your classroom, and so we're going to get started. At any point, if you have any questions come up, if you're having any questions that you really want answered, you can put them in the chat, and then Jonathan will be letting me know if there's any questions coming up. But also if you have something that you really want answered, and if we're not noticing, you can also just unmute yourself and maybe ask to pause or something. And so we'll both be looking at our chat just in case. So, all right. So to get, oh, sorry. All right. So quickly, some Zoom guidelines. Please mute yourself when you're not speaking. What I've noticed in some of our other Zoom sessions sometimes is that when folks don't mute themselves, we might have other noise come in, or even just for whatever reason, it can impact the noise of other people and what they're hearing. So it's just good to mute yourself if you're not speaking. If you're able to, keep your video on so we can see each other and be in community. But I also recognize, we're all working from home, and we might not be jumping into these calls in the best place where we would like to show our video. So please don't feel pressure to do that if you can't. And also for technical reasons, some folks are having just better access to Zoom without the video. So don't worry about it. If you have wired headphones, if that helps you for better sound, by all means, put them on. And also if at any point you have technical issues, use the chat function for help. And also you can always log off and try to rejoin the meeting. It'll be the same link, and we'll be going on from 12 to 1. Any questions so far? Okay, I think we're good. And so for this webinar, we have two outcomes. So we were hoping that out of this, you're able to understand what reflexivity is and why it's important as an educator to practice reflexivity, but also how we can use reflexivity to create strategies for our class. We're in a pandemic, and a lot of things are happening. And so I think this is a really great time for us to reconsider how are we using our reflexive practice to engage and to inform our teaching strategies that we're using in class. So our essential question for today is, how does practicing reflexivity during crisis and beyond inform educator strategies for their class? And so this is just, I want to show this question to you, and we're actually going to have at the end of the class, the webinar, we're actually going to have some time to reflect on this question. So this entire webinar is also going to require, and I'm hoping that you all feel comfortable participating in it and doing some reflection with us. So I'll be leading you in some reflexive journaling, and my hope is after we journal is that we'll be sharing out. So just to begin, I'd actually like you to take a couple minutes. It's 12:06 right now, so we can take 1 to 2 minutes and just write down, how is COVID-19 impacting students? And so if you have that, you can put it in your chat box if you feel comfortable, or you can just write it down. And after 1 to 2 minutes, we'll actually share out what we're hearing from our students. So if you just, yes?
I probably need a better definition of reflexivity, and it's probably basic, and I'm sure it was described at some point somewhere, but can you help me with that just kind of basic definition?
Yes. So the way that I've created this course is I actually want to situate why it's important to be reflexive. So reflexive, and then we're actually going to go into what reflexivity actually is. But just briefly, for those of you who haven't, heard the term before, thank you for bringing that up, Sharonda. Is reflexivity is this way for us to engage on unpacking what our assumptions, our biases, our preconceived notions are, when we're coming into the classroom, right? And how those can influence. And the reason we're wanting to do reflexivity is to understand how those may influence that way that we're perceiving, the interactions we have with our students, the way that we perceive the outcomes that we're having with our students. And so I think during a time of crisis like COVID-19, it is very important as educators that we're actually thinking about, we're actually taking that time to be reflexive, and how is this pandemic impacting our students? And so in understanding how this is impacting our students and taking that time to also consider, our own positionalities, that will help us better create strategies to support our students during this time and meet them where they're at, right? And just, it's very brief, and I'll be going through it again. But at this point, the definition itself isn't as important as just considering, if we're students or if we are educators right now, what are some of our students telling us, or what are we experiencing as students as a result of this pandemic? And so just take, 1 to 2 minutes to write down what you're experiencing if you're a student, and if you're also an educator, what are your students telling you? How is this impacting them? So take some time to write it down. I'll give you 2 minutes. And thank you, Sergio, for sharing that. Absolutely. Yes. So take 1 more minute. And so, for those of you who are just jumping on, we're just answering this question, reflecting, and putting it in the chat. But also, after 1 minute, we're actually going to go and just talk about it together. We're in this space to talk and collaborate during this time. And I have two screens, so I'll be looking at this side for the chat and then here for the presentation. For those of us just joining, just take some moments to think about how is COVID-19 impacting students. And if you feel comfortable, please go ahead and put it in the chat, and or we're also going to talk about it. All right, so our 2 minutes are up. So just briefly, some of the things that I'm already seeing, well, Sergio brought up what reflexivity is in this example by saying they're thinking about it as a way to reflect on what is happening, like what you're doing to support students, and also the ways that you can be perpetuating lack of support during this time. And so I think Sergio brings up an important point about why reflexivity is important. Sometimes, unfortunately, what can happen when we're not being reflexive is that we actually do perpetuate inequitable practices or strategies, and are actually not supporting our students in the way that we think we're supporting them. And so thank you, Sergio, for bringing that up. Now, in terms of the actual question, how is COVID-19 impacting students? I see Jennifer wrote, there's massive stress and anxiety. Absolutely. I also saw Shelby was writing, students are experiencing more stress in their personal lives and feeling uncertain about the future. you know and Sharonda wrote, they're easily overwhelmed. Students are feeling tired. There's this distractibility and anger that's coming up. And there's a couple more responses in terms of like needing flexibility. Jonathan wrote, teacher support is very important right now. And then Dong wrote, confusion and anxiety. So like now that I've seen like some of the folks, do any of you feel comfortable sharing a little bit more about this, about your responses? Sergio, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you so much for this workshop, first of all. And I'm glad that sorry, I muted myself again. Sorry. So thank you. So I think for me, what I was really thinking about, I was thinking about the context, right? So like the context as an educator, as a student affairs practitioner, right? And so I'm thinking about, as I said earlier, like what are ways that like we're either supporting and or perpetuating like these extremities that are going on right now, which is like lack of resources, lack of access, because I think the COVID-19 is really impacting the disparity of education, like nationwide and worldwide, but here in this nation. And so I'm thinking specifically, like, what are we doing as folks within the institution to actually perpetuate and create more disparity by creating more assignments, creating more things, more requirements, because things have shifted to online when there's a lot of students out there that don't have like Wi-Fi, don't have access to resources like a laptop, don't have a privacy to be like, hey, I need you to be quiet for the next 3 hours because I need to be like in a Zoom classroom once a week. Like that's like a lot of privileges that we're imposing on students and sometimes ourselves, right? Like in these spaces, because not everyone has their own apartment, their own home. And so like I think about all of that and what I'm doing to either like provide more support or actually perpetuate and create more disparity?
Thank you for bringing that up, Sergio. I think you highlighted some important things there, right? Unfortunately, as educators, we can both serve as support systems, but also as folks that can be gatekeepers or folks who can negatively impact the way that students are perceiving their education and their learning. And so it is important for us to be considerate and reflexive of what they're experiencing. So just for the sake of time, thank you for sharing that. And I appreciate everyone who's participated in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next portion. And so this is all still in line, and I think you've already brought up some of the things that I'm going to bring up. So here's some of the what I've been reading about in terms of what's happening to our students. So we know COVID-19 is disproportionately impacting the most disenfranchised communities, Black, Indigenous people of color, working class folks, immigrants. And so we're recognizing that this impact is including, loss of income due to pay cuts or even completely losing your job. And unfortunately, during this time, this means that specific populations are being impacted heavily, right? According to some of the research, Latinx households and undocumented communities are heavily impacted. For multiple reasons, but having that loss of income is one of the biggest on a systemic level we consider, right? Like how that has after effects. And so when we think about like systemic inequalities, those are impacting our most vulnerable students. We already know that our most vulnerable students aren't necessarily set up in the same way with equitable resources to support them succeed. But now because of these systemic inequities, it's further exacerbated that the wealth disparities, it's further exacerbated the vulnerability that our students are experiencing. And so to that, we're also seeing because of the racialization of this pandemic too, that there are higher rates of hate crimes against Asian American and Pacific Islanders. And that includes both physical and verbal assaults. And so what does this mean for our students who are coming into the classroom and potentially experiencing this, or having family members experiencing this, the verbal or physical assaults? Then in addition to that, we also have students who, in the spring had to pick up and leave within a couple of days. They had to move back home, and also start working and doing their work from home while taking on potentially other responsibilities as caregivers for their family members, and also having to navigate because there's been this loss of income, because there's been, issues with like potentially losing your job, now having to deal with the anxiety that some of you mentioned, right? About how are you going to pay for some of your basic needs? How are you going to, what happens to the family members who are considered essential workers and are going out and working? And in addition, one of the things that's highlighted with what you were all mentioning in terms of like anger, being overwhelmed, being confused and anxious, we're also having students who are experiencing like unhealthy living environments. And so what does that look like, and what does that mean for our students as they're coming into a classroom? They're bringing all of this in with them into the classroom, whether or not we are fully aware of what's happening. And so we also see that students who might be in the foster care system might be aging out, and they're now facing additional financial insecurity and housing insecurity, and also the unstable employment, given that the pandemic has really upended our entire, employment paradigm that we have. And so we have to consider that when we're thinking about our students, we don't always fully understand like who are our students and how many different ways they come and are impacted by this pandemic. We also have LGBTQ plus students who've had to go back to homes that they weren't necessarily supported in, or they might actually be unsafe in due to their gender identity or sexuality. And so many of them might also be experiencing issues with mental health concerns. And I think a consensus from everyone in the chat was that a lot of folks are experiencing potentially mental health concerns because of this pandemic, and they might have been further exacerbated because students are having to move back home, because students are having to navigate, what the world looks like for them now, with the financial security, with housing insecurity, and the amount of responsibilities that they have to take on. So again, how do these systemic inequities impact our students? they might have less access to resources to connect to remote learning. And that's one of the first things that started to come up right when we transition online. A lot of institutions unfortunately might have made the assumption that our students were well equipped to transition to remote learning without considering the inequity in who has access to these resources, and even the potential of not being able to pay for college. What does that look like for students if their funding is cut, and if they're funding part of their educational trajectory? So whether that's paying for tuition or paying for books or paying for technology, if they're now impacted financially, that means that they're going to be impacted in their ability to pay for what they need for college. And again, I'll reiterate, a lot of students are facing basic needs not being met, or the potential of them not being met, because we have housing and food insecurity. Those are those are considered basic needs, but yet we're having students who were already struggling this with before, but now it's been further exacerbated. And so what does this look like as we're considering the students who are coming into our classrooms? And so in addition to that, there is less access to medical care for some communities. And this is especially alarming during a pandemic, when we consider our most vulnerable communities are contracting COVID-19, or who may have family members who are sick, because of what's happened also in the response, unfortunately, by our federal government, that has further impacted the vulnerability of communities and who is being left out of the resources. And so we have to consider those social inequalities and inequities. And, according to the WHO, those things impact our community's mental health. And so what does this mean as our students are coming in to our classrooms and are impacted on such a deep level? How do we remain cognizant? How do we remain introspective about these experiences as we're planning for, as we planned for the spring transition, as we plan for the summer transition, and then as we're planning now for the fall transition, considering that some students might be asked to go back to campus and as educators, as well as others folks are still going to continue remote learning with still not having the resources to continue that. So this is why reflexivity is important during a time of crisis. There's so much happening. And one of the things I didn't include in this, when I started this webinar, it was focused heavily on COVID-19. But in the course of this pandemic, we've also seen an uprising, and we've seen, the movement for Black Lives Matter being further pushed for, and the protests and uprising pushing for more support for our Black communities and more equity, and challenging the racism and the systemic white supremacy that is pervasive in this country and in many others. And so I didn't add a bullet point to that originally when I created this, but I want to also recognize that, that might not be my position to fully delve deep into that, right? We've had some wonderful webinars from Dr. Bettina Love, Dr. Troy Weiston, who had that conversation, and it was a wonderful conversation. We've had a couple other conversations that we've seen that, but it's also been a platform for the Black community to share that. But I do want to highlight that that's also an experience that our Black students are experiencing and our Black educators. And so how are we supporting them and recognizing that, all of this is happening? Not to say that racism and white supremacy wasn't happening before, but the tension is definitely higher because there's been the uprisings, because we're in a pandemic, and we're seeing the way that our communities are being so deeply impacted. And so I do also recognize that, to have that conversation, it's a much larger conversation. And so, if you have any other ideas or anything that you would like to talk about, please feel free to share them in the chat to us. And we're also considering, how do we continue to create content to talk about this and have these conversations. So now to that, I want us to take just a minute or two to reflect, how is COVID-19 impacting educators? And I know some of you had already mentioned, so just please go ahead and write down, take a minute or two. And if you're just joining, we have a minute or two to just write down and reflect on, how is COVID-19 impacting educators? All right, so thank you for sharing, and please feel free to drop in more of your thoughts. Do I have anyone who wants to talk more about this? I've seen a couple of folks talk about this transition online. I mean, thank you for raising your hand. Go ahead.
All right, so I'm just gonna. I like what you're sharing, so I feel like I have a responsibility to share. But and I just take this with a grain of salt too. But a week ago, I just got confirmed for COVID, and I've been positive for about a week and a half now. So as an educator, or in this business, everything you said is true. And as an educator, one of the biggest things was the physicality you have in your classroom, and now that's gone. Um, if you're a student as well and an educator, this takes you out for about 30 days, easy. That's a mild case. So anybody who has anything to do with COVID or anything like that, it's immediately that's like a month that you have the anxieties, you have that's that social stress where you're like, oh dang, if people, what do people think about me now? You also have the trouble breathing, and you just have the fatigue. The fatigue is big too. So as an educator, there's like that sudden worry and that sudden change where you really have to readjust your whole structure of education when once you get it. So it's really important to think that like how can you adapt yourself, or how can you um, keep your keep your education moving for the people you need to keep it moving. So I think it was just, as somebody who has it, I just think it's important to throw it out there to say that like all these anxieties and all these things is pretty true. And for if there's a student that has any lack of resources or they're in that state of crisis, it's gonna affect them really, really hard.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, I think, we have to normalize the fact that because we are in a pandemic, we're actually going to meet and know more people who are impacted by it, right? Who test positive. So thank you for sharing that. It's challenging, and we know that everyone who tests positive has different experiences with, the illness, and the symptoms are different. But one of the things that a lot of folks have shared is the fatigue, and how is that impacting our educators? So, everything I shared about what's happening to students, that's actually happening to educators too, right? We're seeing that happen. And I mean, you shared your example, and yes, absolutely, like this is like how your physical health is impacting your ability to do your work, but also you have to take care of yourself. And what does that look like in a time when educators are being asked to do so much and transition so quickly? And then also recognize, that you have students who have a lot of needing to be met at this time, and recognizing the capacity of like up to where you can actually meet those needs. So thank you again for sharing. I'm also seeing, other folks who are talking about this push to have to transition and move quickly online, and there's a technology learning gap. Having, I see also, faculty who are not necessarily having the same support that they had on campus to teach. And so what does that look like? I see Jennifer wrote, there's an anxiety and stress as well as the new demands to gain online teaching skills, worries about learning losses with economic discrepancies. Absolutely. Again, our whole economic system has been upended and it's been shifted. And so that also means that, the opportunities for educators, the opportunities in these institutions like are shifting too, and they're being cut. And so what does that mean for a lot of us long term if we're going to have access to that same, those same funding resources? And unfortunately, all of this is leading to a lot of anxiety and stress among so many educators. Also, I see Carla wrote, much harder to have traditional discussions. Yes, there we have a way of teaching online, and there's ways that, can be organic, and we're able to use our classroom, our space in a way that unfortunately has now completely been, taken away from us because we're transitioned online. And I think that also connects to this notion of like feeling that there is a disconnection from our learners and our educators because we are no longer in that same space, sharing that space together. So thank you for sharing that. And then I also see Sergio brought up this piece of like lack of self-care to meet the academic needs, and folks not feeling safe to say anything to administration. Would you like to share more about that? Or does anyone like have an experience or something they want to share about that? This feeling like you can't, you don't have the time for self-care, or because you have so many other academic tasks to meet, or also feeling unsafe being able to communicate with your administration and advocate for yourself and for your students.
This is Sharonda. I mean, it might be self-imposed. Obviously we all have high expectations of ourselves as educators. And we're going through a lot of those same things our students are going through. And you add then, I think, the expectation that I have for myself to kind of compensate for the negatives of online learning. So you spend even more time trying to explain lessons and research accessible material, and you do even more than you would potentially traditionally do if you saw your students twice a week, because you want to compensate for all of these things, whether educationally or out in the world that's happening. So the self-care is put on the back burner because our hearts do go out to the students, and we want to compensate for all these things that are happening in their lives, and potentially not realizing that those same things are happening in our lives. So we need to spend more time with us on self-care too.
Absolutely. And I think you actually just led to why I added this question. So I actually don't have other slides talking about what's happening, because what is happening is impacting our students and our educators. We're all experiencing this as a collective. And so, what does this idea of reflexivity isn't only for us, right? Or isn't only for our students, and like, how do we support our students? But reflexivity is also a way for us to recognize and become self-aware of what is actually happening with us. What is our positionality during this time? How are our lives changing as we're in a pandemic, and recognizing, I actually might need some self-care. I actually need to spend some time filling my cup before I can fill other people's cups. And being able to re-energize, rest and recharge allows us to then show up for our students in a better way, in a way that is also healthier for us, right? Because unfortunately, what we thought might be a couple months when this pandemic started has now, like, at this point, it seems like it's going to go on for the rest of the year, and we still don't know, right, how much longer. There isn't an end date. And so how do we make sure that we're building sustainable practices for ourselves and for our students? We're all human beings, and we do deserve to take care of ourselves, and we do deserve to have, ways to support our students, but also have boundaries in how we're doing it to continue to take care of ourselves, because this is the long game. And so again, thank you so much for sharing that, Sharonda. It was well put. Thank you. I think you voiced what a lot of educators are experiencing right now, this push for wanting to like really show up for our students, but then recognizing that we're also going through a lot. So thank you. And so I'm actually going to move on into the next portion. Sharonda had brought up, like, what is reflexivity? And so this is where we start to kind of engage in what that is and how we view it at PFF2. So reflexivity allows us to actually continue to stay alert to the conditioned or habituated thinking and responses, so that we're open to diverse and emergent situations, as well as new ideas and perspectives. So, because of the way that we've thought about ourselves as educators, as students, etc., sometimes we become very entrenched in those ways of thinking. And so reflexivity allows us to have a pause and check ourselves, right? Check, what is my thinking? Like, is this really, are these my assumptions now? Where am I actually, how am I coming to these ideas? And how are these ideas, how am I enforcing them on my students? And how is that impacting the way that my students are engaging, the way that my students are actually being impacted, by my teaching strategies, by the way that I'm choosing to engage my students, right? So for example, at the very beginning, we might have had a lot of us who were like, we're still going to be doing our 3-hour classes. And so we were, fully entrenched in the idea that we were going to do 3-hour Zoom classes. But as time has persisted, maybe we're coming to this reality as educators. One, that's not even sustainable for me as an educator. But two, is that even possible or effective for my students? And so in that way, that's how we engage in reflexivity. And so at PFF, we have 5 teacher leader mindsets. We have ethical thinking, design thinking, reflexive thinking, co-creative thinking, and then systems and plural thinking. And so for ethical thinking, we're considering like, how are we designing our learning to actually ensure that all our learners are engaged and supported through that process, right? So that they're not only able to survive, but they're flourishing in their future. So we're not only seeing our students as, our students that we'll have for our class, but also for long term. What does that mean? How are we supporting them to set them up for the future? With our design thinking, we're being really intentional about the approaches that we're actually using with our learners, and how we're supporting them in their current and their future context. So we really have to consider the ways that we're designing this work. And reflexive thinking, again, it's that introspection. It's where we are examining our assumptions, developing our own self-knowledge and self-awareness, and working in this idea of like really challenging, what are our value sets. And this reflexive thinking is a way for us to just acknowledge that we are lifelong learners, and no one prepared us for this pandemic, and we're having to readjust and relearn and become self-aware. And that again demonstrates how we are all lifelong learners. While things might have worked before, things aren't working, and so we have to readjust. And so in this, this reflexivity, this ethical thinking and design thinking also allows us to be co-creative, to actually develop teaching and learning as a co-creative process, right? Where we collaborate with our learners, where we're working in tandem and we're co-creating together. And what does that look like, especially during a time that we're in a pandemic, and we're learning from them. Just as some of us have technology gaps, our students might actually know other resources or platforms, and they're teaching us how do we use these and leverage them with our class, right? And so we're co-creating, but we're also co-creating strategies, expectations, what's realistic for us in the classroom at this point in time, whereas our expectations might have been different before. And so we also think about the systems and plural way of thinking. A lot of systemic inequities have definitely been highlighted during this time. And so being able to consider the systems and those interconnections and the complexity of those contexts allows us to remain creative and adaptive to different emerging situations. And so these are the 5 teacher leader mindsets that we use in PFF for that reason. And so again, going into reflexivity, these are 2 ways of considering reflective practice. And so we have this, we typically have, we have to consider, why do we do what we do? Why are we in the classroom? Why are we choosing to follow this path? And that's connected to our goals, our values, our beliefs, our worldviews and assumptions. But then we also have, what do we actually do? How do we show those, right? How do we show these values, these beliefs? What actions do we take? What are the methods that we're using, or approaches, or what strategies are we using? And then out of all this, like, what do we obtain from these actions, right? From these beliefs that we put into action? We get our results or consequences sometimes, and the outcomes. And so in the classroom, when we think about this, sometimes, we can veer towards a single loop learning. Not to say everyone is doing this, but sometimes it happens where, we look at what's happened, the outcomes, and then we problem solve, but we only problem solve by looking at some of the actions, right? Like what happened, and that's where we end. So what happens is that we don't examine our own assumptions, our own values that we're bringing into the classroom. And so that could be a problem when we're considering, if we're only looking at the outcomes right now, our students, maybe they didn't do so well in a class, but then we're only examining, we transition online and that's it. That's the only reason this is happening. But we're not considering, what assumptions did I bring into the class that shaped my perspective. And so that's where we have to not engage in the single loop learning, but actually shifting to a double loop learning. And so we're revising or affirming our underlying values and beliefs. And so in this way, we look at the outcomes, and then we go to actually, what assumptions shaped these outcomes? What assumptions shaped our approaches and our methods that then led to our outcomes? And so in this way, we have a more holistic understanding of how it is that we came out to have these particular outcomes. And so with our students right now, if we look at, what assumptions, what did we think was happening when we transition online? And then we look at our methods, how did we transition online? What were the things, like, where our assumptions changed? Did we consider our assumptions? And that can really inform how we improve our approach and our methods to have better outcomes in our classroom. And so again, just to put it again, single loop learning, it's a way for us to engage in action and get outcomes that are what we expect and reinforce our thought, words, and actions. So sometimes, we examine outcomes, especially when things go wrong, and we might make changes to our actions going forward, right? So like we might say, oh, this didn't, this approach we used didn't work. And that's the extent of our reflexivity. But we're not actually examining what motives, what values we brought into the classroom or beliefs and how those influence our actions. And so then we attribute things and we externalize them to other outcomes or in other situations outside of ourselves. But as educators, we also have to recognize, what are we doing? How are we impacting our students and their learning? And so that's where double loop learning comes in. Not only are we paying attention to the outcomes of our actions, but we're being introspective. We're examining those assumptions, those beliefs, those values in consideration of what's happening, right? And we can ask and we can affirm or reinforce and consider, like, what needs to actually be changed? How do we modify? How do we, build so it's aligning to our current circumstances? Especially we're in a different time. We're not where we were a couple months ago. And so we have to reconsider, how are we adapting? How are we changing to meet the needs of our learners, but also meet our own needs as educators? And so this is where, again, we're going to do a little bit of reflexive practice. So I want you all to think about, now that we've thought about some of these ideas of reflexivity, and considered what our students are going through, what we as educators are going through, let's consider what are strategies that might improve the communication we have with our students. So just take a minute or two and jot them down, and then if you want to share in the chat, please go ahead, and then after 2 minutes we can also unmute ourselves and share. Okay. So just take one more minute. All right, our 2 minutes are up. So if you want to go ahead and share your ideas, and again, they don't have to be, perfect, like sentences, ideas, do bullets, whatever feels right to you, and just share it in the chat, and or also unmute yourself, and we can have a conversation. This is a co-creative space, and the point is that when we're doing these webinars, it's not just for us to, impart these perspectives and knowledge, but it's also for us to be in a space with other educators and co-create together, come up with strategies together. Okay, see, so I see Jennifer wrote, show empathy, be flexible, ask them what they need, and then be creative how to meet that. So I think too that I would also say, also show empathy to yourself and be flexible with yourself too, right? And also ask yourself, what do you need? What needs aren't being met? And then together be co-creative with your students. How can we come up with, how can we meet your needs? How can we together come up with a solution? That might also be a way that you're working with them, and they're also taking ownership of how, of a very small time where they have control, which is maybe the classroom, where they can figure out how to come up with ways to meet their needs in the classroom with you. And so Shelby wrote, create an open and safe place to discuss, to have discussions about what is going on. Absolutely. I think one of the most important things of teaching and building a teaching student relationship is having that trust, right? And when we have that trust, students will start to feel more open and feel like they're in a safe, and or if not safe, a brave place to have discussions about what's happening in their homes. And it's becoming more normalized too, because so many of us are being impacted that it's almost like we have to share maybe more than we thought we ever would share with each other about what's happening. I see Sergio wrote, check myself and cut down assignments and busy work to meet my co-creators where they're at instead of meeting the institution's wants and needs. Absolutely. Sometimes, we have also, we're perfectionists. We have these ideas and all these ways that we want to engage and work, and all these creative ideas to engage in the classroom, but then sometimes might not recognize that one of the most important things we could do right now is also to scale back a little bit and check ourselves. Um, and then, wrote, daily messaging can go a long way, even if it's just a joke or a well-being check-in. A weekend breakout session can help to create rapport and connection. Absolutely. During this pandemic, we're having to be very creative of how are we communicating, how are we building community in a time that we're not physically able to be in a space together and share that space. So definitely, Catherine wrote, allow yourself to be vulnerable, open discussions that are not content related or graded. Yes, the vulnerability goes a long way, right? Like, you have to develop trust to get to that point with your students, but being vulnerable allows other people, it's a risk to be vulnerable, but it can allow other students to feel willing to take that risk and also be vulnerable and share what's happening. Because the other thing to this is, while we know all these things are happening and we recognize that our students are carrying these experiences, as are we, sometimes when students don't share these things, we're not mind readers either. And so we might still be making assumptions of how students are being impacted that are actually not true. So having that space to be vulnerable and have those open dialogues are necessary. Oh, I see Sharonda wrote that they're planning to use BB Tech tools so you can do more proactive interventions with students that are not engaging. Oh, I've never heard of BB Tech. If you want to share more, please do. And again, I've read out what you all have said, but is there anything else you want to share? Please go ahead and, unmute yourselves. Oh, Blackboard. Maybe? Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm actually going to go forward. So some of the strategies that I had considered are, how do we extend our office hours? And that doesn't mean, being realistic with ourselves too in our capacity. What does that look like? But potentially extending hours or shifting our hours is another way to consider it. Amin brought up the point of, like, maybe checking in during via text or on the weekend and creating those other alternative, like, community building moments. Then also maybe potentially creating a discussion board through whatever learning management system that you use, is a space where a space that students know they can ask other questions, and either students can answer them with each other if they have the answer, but also you can check and make sure that you're answering and making sure that students are getting these questions answered, but it might not be where you have to meet face to face, especially if students might not have access to technology to be able, or space to do a Zoom meeting, and you might not. So you have that ability to create one space on your learning management site to have those discussions and communicate. Also, maybe using announcements on your learning management sites to the best of their abilities. How do you create, like, targeted announcements for students, to provide reminders, to provide resources, to help students ensure that they're always getting their check-ins, right? Also, maybe the potential is maybe you don't extend your office hours, but some of you have already mentioned that, you know, you build time in class for check-ins, you build time in class to have those discussions and dialogues. And it's not only, like Catherine had mentioned, about the content and the materials you have to cover, but it's also about the person and what's happening with each other. So that's definitely a way. These are not all encompassing, and please, you know, what we've seen on the chat, there's different ways that folks are considering strategies. So thank you for sharing. And so now let's shift this a little bit. What are the strategies? Take a minute or two and consider what are strategies that might be useful for assessments, you know, for assignments that we're giving our students. So just take 1 to 2 minutes, and, you know, when you feel ready, and if you feel ready, please go ahead and put them on the chat. Mhm. Just take 1 more minute. All right, so we're gonna just go through some of what you mentioned in the chat. So I see similarly, Shelby, Lamar, and then Jennifer were both thinking about similar things. So one of them is more flexible late work policies, and then Jennifer mentioned flexible due dates. So absolutely, that's one of the strategies that you can consider, right? How are we being flexible and agile during this time of crisis? And also, how do we carry this forward not only now, but later, right? And then Jonathan mentioned differentiated assignments. So the potential of like actually considering the needs, the areas of our students, and differentiating our assessments in that way. Catherine mentioned asking students how they will demonstrate skills, a longer essay, a creative piece, giving them autonomy while allowing students to see and educators to see the skills that they've acquired and conversations about learning. Absolutely. Are there any other strategies that you all want to mention or examples that you've tried in your class that you would like to share, or even as a student that you've seen your faculty do? Sergio wrote, taking out assignments. Grades would not be the first priority during this pandemic. Absolutely. You know, I mean, it's important to really consider what's the most important information I want my students to get out of this class, right? The content, the material, the lessons outside of just the content and material that I want students to get out of this class. And do assignments play a key role in ensuring that students are actually getting this out of the class? So definitely. So I think in line to that, thank you for sharing. You know, one of the first things I wrote is scaling back the assessments. Absolutely. You know, we're not in the same time and so many things are happening. And even for ourselves as educators, you know, do we all have that capacity to grade all the assignments that we had planned, you know, pre-COVID-19? Is that realistic for us? Is that realistic for our students? And will all these assessments really get to what we want to know, right, about our students and what they've taken away from this class? So definitely considering scaling back. Maybe, you know, for those of us who are doing testing, you know, maybe we're creating open book assessments so that we know that they're definitely keeping track of their notes and like getting this information, but because they're not on campus and might not have the same resources that they had while they were on campus, they have this resource that they can use while taking assessments. Maybe, what was brought up here, the flexible due dates or flexible late work policies. Maybe it's also allowing multiple attempts for assessments. If you didn't do well, that might have well been because, you got distracted or you didn't have the space that day to really do the work. Can you have multiple attempts for students and for, to allow students to learn from their mistakes? Things happen, we all make mistakes, we're all human. And so sometimes those multiple attempts reinforce in our students that it's okay to make a mistake and that we learn from that. And so I see Catherine wrote, agree, makes us think more about why of the assessment. Absolutely. We really, as we're creating our assessments, why are we doing them? How are these informing our teaching and the understanding and what our students are learning? So really considering the why. And so maybe shifting some of the summative assessments to become more formative assessments just to gauge the learning, but maybe they're not. In that way, you're able to tackle on earlier if students are struggling, if you need to reshift, if you need to spend more time going over some specific content, right? But also recognizing if maybe we don't need one big summative assessment, but a couple formative assessments to really inform, and how we can actually then create a summative assessment that makes the most sense to where students are in their understanding and learning. So again, these are not all encompassing strategies. You've all shared a couple more. So thank you for sharing. These are just some ideas to get us thinking. And I mean, you're always welcome to consider and also reach out to us and we can think together and co-create, just like we did right now, some other strategies that we could use. And so just remember, I think sometimes we forget teaching is a skill and we got to practice it. Teaching is fluid and we have to continue to learn. We're lifelong learners. And so we part of this of being educators is preparing for these difficult situations before they happen. But sometimes we can't. And so then how are we being reflexive as educators to get through these tough situations? What can we do now that we've been in this for a couple months? How can what the experience has been the last couple of months inform the way that we're going to shift moving forward, right? How is this going to inform the way that we're choosing to engage in the fall? And so, being reflexive is one of the key things that I think helps us in this, because it could allow us to see what could have been better, right? For those of you who taught in the spring or the summer, you've had some experience seeing what's happened with students and also how what you've done has impacted them, right? So you could consider what could have been better, what worked really great, what did you really enjoy from your classes. And as students too, we know that our educators had to shift and consider how they were going to do their classes, and there were some things that worked really great and some things that maybe didn't work as great. And then also, what assumptions did we make, preparing our classes? And as we're going into the fall, what assumptions have we made in the past couple months? And how can we shift these assumptions and challenge them to do better? And so again, we all make mistakes. We're all human. We just have to learn from them. And that's, I think, one of the most important things we can take from this is that reflexivity allows us to also recognize that we are lifelong learners and that whenever we do make mistakes, we can continue to improve. And a mistake isn't, the end. It's just a way for us to see an area of growth that we need to focus on and fix it and keep on improving. And things, the things that worked at one point might not work again, and we continue to be reflexive to ensure we understand how we can continue to do better. And so just going back to our essential question, take a minute and consider, how does practicing reflexivity during crisis and beyond inform educator strategies for their class? And so if you want to take a minute, and then if you want to write down any thoughts that you have in your chat, or if you want to unmute yourself after the minute, please go ahead and share. Right. So our minute is kind of coming to an end, and we have 3 more minutes. If anyone has any thoughts they'd like to share, please unmute yourself or put it in the chat. Since we're running out of time. I'm going to go ahead and just share some information briefly. For PFF, you will have access to the slides so you can review them. I recognize it was a lot of information, so please, by all means, go back and review. Here's our website, our email, and the services that we provide. We do consultations with folks. We do webinars, as we're doing right now. We also create other resources, and we also have the PFF College Teaching Certificate. And this is not only for folks who've never, taught before, but also for folks who are already teaching and maybe want to retool or reconsider how we continue to adapt, right? And also for folks who aren't teaching and are doing other things, but are wanting to use these skill sets and build them in other avenues and perspectives. And so a couple resources I highlighted on this are listed below. Many of them are videos, which I appreciate sometimes. Videos sometimes during this time can be helpful. And then also other reading materials. But I have all the references, all the things that I mentioned and links to them. So by all means, if you want to do some of your own reading and looking at these references, please do. And Jonathan is going to share the bit.ly link for the slides as well in the chat. And Jennifer, thank you for sharing. It's helping teachers be reasonable in what to expect from self and from students. Absolutely. Being reflexive allows us to maybe check ourselves too, right? Like, are we being reasonable during this time? Am I making assumptions about my time and what my productivity looks like, and the time of my students and what their productivity looks like? Absolutely. And then thank you, Shelby, for sharing the links to the rest of the PFF webinars that are happening this month. So, there'll be one on Tuesday and Thursday coming up next week as well. But thank you all for holding space and sharing time with me. I appreciate everything you all shared. And once we get the recording out, we'll share it with you all. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day. And please stay safe out there and get better for those of you who are sick.